The stagecoach rattled violently as it hit another deep rut on the dusty road to Pecos, Texas. Nora Vaughn clutched her worn leather valise tightly against her chest, her knuckles white with tension. It was 1878, and she had traveled over 1,000 miles from Boston to marry a man she had never met, a wealthy cattle baron named Bartholomew Jenkins. The advertisement had promised security and comfort, two things that had been painfully absent from her life since her father's death left her destitute. "Not much farther now, miss," the driver called back. "Pecos is just beyond that ridge." Nora nodded, though no one could see her. Her stomach churned with anxiety. The letters from Mr. Jenkins had been cordial, if somewhat terse. He had paid for her passage west and promised her a good life as his wife. At 22, with no prospects and her mother recently passed, what choice did she have? As the stagecoach crested the hill, Pecos sprawled before them, a dusty collection of wooden buildings straddling the banks of the Pecos River. The town was larger than she expected, with a main street lined with establishments. A church steeple rose above the other buildings, offering a small comfort. When the stagecoach finally lurched to a stop in front of the Pecos Hotel, Nora smoothed her travel-worn dress and adjusted her bonnet. The driver opened the door, and she stepped down, her legs unsteady after the long journey. "Miss Vaughn." A tall man with a bushy mustache and expensive, if dust-covered, clothing approached her. "Yes, that's me," she replied, her voice barely audible over the bustle of the street. "Bartholomew Jenkins." He looked her up and down with cold, assessing eyes. "You're smaller than I expected." Nora swallowed hard. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Jenkins." He gestured to a young boy standing nearby. "Boy, take Miss Vaughn's things to my wagon." As the boy scurried to follow his orders, Jenkins turned back to her. "We'll be married tomorrow. Tonight you'll stay at the hotel. I've business to attend to." Without waiting for her response, he turned and strode away, leaving Nora standing alone in the street, clutching her reticule. She felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. This was her choice, her only option. "Miss? Do you need help with your bags?" Nora turned to find a young man standing beside her. Tall and lean, with sandy brown hair and kind blue eyes, he stood in stark contrast to Jenkins's imposing, cold demeanor. "I believe that boy is taking care of them, thank you," she replied. "I'm Matthew Young," he said, removing his hat. "Town deputy. First time in Pecos?" "Yes." She managed a weak smile. "I'm Nora Vaughn. I've just arrived from Boston to be married." Matthew's eyebrows rose slightly. "To Bart Jenkins?" Something in his tone made her heart sink further. "Yes." "Do you know him well?" Matthew hesitated. "Everyone knows everyone in Pecos, madam." He gestured toward the hotel. "Let me escort you inside." The sun's mighty fierce for someone not used to Texas. As they walked the short distance to the hotel entrance, Nora couldn't help but notice how the townspeople seemed to stare at her with what looked like pity. "Is something wrong, Deputy Young?" she asked quietly as they reached the hotel porch. Matthew paused, his expression troubled. "It's not my place to say, Miss Vaughn, but—" He lowered his voice. "Jenkins has a reputation in these parts. And it ain't for kindness." Before she could ask more, he tipped his hat. "I should get back to my duties. If you need anything at all during your stay, the sheriff's office is just down the street." Nora checked into her room at the hotel, her mind racing with worry. The deputy's words echoed in her thoughts as she unpacked her meager belongings. What had she gotten herself into? That evening, as she sat alone in the hotel's dining room picking at a plate of beef and potatoes, she overheard two women at a nearby table. "That's her Jenkins's mail-order bride," one whispered. "Poor thing," the other replied. "Doesn't know what she's in for. Third wife in 5 years." Wonder what happened to make him need another one so soon. Nora felt ill. Setting down her fork, she returned to her room, where she spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, wondering if she should board the next stagecoach back east. But where would she go? Who would take her in? She had spent her last dollar to get to Pecos. The next morning, a knock at her door revealed a stern-faced woman with a package. "Mr. Jenkins sent this for you to wear today," she said, thrusting the parcel into Nora's hands. Inside was a wedding dress surprisingly beautiful, made of cream-colored silk with delicate lace trim. It fit her perfectly, which was unsettling. How had he known her measurements? At precisely 10 o'clock, a carriage arrived to take her to the church. Her hands trembled as she gathered her courage and stepped outside. The town seemed unusually quiet for a Saturday morning. The church was nearly empty when she arrived. Jenkins stood at the altar with the preacher, his back ramrod straight, not even turning to look at his bride. A few townspeople sat scattered in the pews, their expressions solemn. No one smiled. No one whispered excited congratulations. As she walked down the aisle alone, Nora felt like she was marching to her doom rather than her wedding. When she reached the altar, Jenkins finally turned to her, his eyes cold as they had been the day before. The ceremony began, the preacher's words droning on as Nora's panic mounted. When he asked if anyone had reason to object to this union, the church door burst open. "I object." Matthew Young strode down the aisle, his deputy badge gleaming in the light streaming through the stained glass windows. Jenkins turned, his face contorted with rage. "This is outrageous. On what grounds?" Matthew's gaze softened as it met Nora's before hardening again as he looked at Jenkins. "On the grounds that your previous wife's death was no accident, and the sheriff has just received telegram confirmation of it from Austin." Gasps filled the church. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. "What is he talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jenkins's hand shot out, gripping her arm painfully. "He's lying. This is preposterous." "Let her go, Jenkins," Matthew said, his hand moving to rest on his holstered gun. "She's my property. I paid for her passage." Jenkins snarled. "No man owns another, not in this country," Matthew replied calmly. "Not anymore." The church doors opened again as the sheriff entered, followed by two deputies. "Bartholomew Jenkins, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Jenkins." What followed was chaos. Jenkins released Nora's arm only to reach for a hidden derringer in his vest. Before he could aim it, Matthew tackled him to the ground. The gun discharged, the bullet splintering wood from a nearby pew. Women screamed. Men shouted. The sheriff and his deputies rushed forward to subdue Jenkins, who fought like a wild animal. Through it all, Nora stood frozen at the altar, her wedding dress suddenly feeling like a shroud. When it was over, when Jenkins had been dragged away shouting threats and obscenities, Matthew approached her cautiously. "Are you all right, Miss Vaughn?" She nodded numbly, then shook her head. "I don't know. What happens now?" "Now," Matthew said gently, "you're free to make your own choice, but you shouldn't be alone right now. Would you allow me to escort you back to the hotel?" That afternoon, Nora sat in the hotel parlor with Matthew and Sheriff Caldwell as they explained what they knew. Jenkins had been widowed twice, or so everyone believed. His first wife had died of fever, though the doctor had questioned the symptoms. His second wife had fallen down the stairs at their ranch house 6 months ago. A housemaid who had recently left his employment had finally gathered the courage to tell authorities she suspected foul play. But why would he? Why would anyone? Nora couldn't finish the sentence. "Money," the sheriff said grimly. Both ladies came with substantial dowries, which he gained control of upon marriage. "We found letters in his desk," He's been corresponding with at least 3 other women back east. Nora felt sick. What will happen to him? He'll stand trial. With the evidence mounting and witnesses coming forward now that he's in custody, I expect he'll hang, Sheriff Caldwell said matter-of-factly. After the sheriff left, Matthew stayed behind. Miss Vaughn, I know this is forward of me, but I wanted to offer my assistance. Pecos is a good town with good people. If you'd like to stay, I'm sure Mrs. Wilson at the dress shop could use help, or perhaps the school needs a teacher. Nora looked at him in surprise. You think I should stay? After all this? That's entirely your decision, Matthew said. But I'd hate to think of you making such a long journey back with nowhere to go. He hesitated. And selfishly, I'd like the chance to show you that not all men in Pecos are like Jenkins. Over the next few weeks, as Jenkins awaited trial in the county jail, Nora indeed found work at Mrs. Wilson's dress shop. Her fine stitching, learned during better days in Boston, impressed the older woman, who was happy to have skilled help. Matthew called on her regularly, first under the pretense of checking on her welfare as part of his deputy duties, then more openly as a suitor. He brought her wildflowers, escorted her to church on Sundays, and gradually introduced her to the genuine warmth of Pecos society, so different from the cold reception she'd initially received as Jenkins's bride. One evening, as they walked along the river after supper at the hotel, Matthew finally asked the question that had been on his mind. Miss Vaughn, Nora, may I ask why you agreed to marry a stranger? A woman as lovely and capable as yourself surely had prospects in Boston. Nora sighed. My father was a merchant who lost everything in bad investments before he died. My mother and I were left with nothing but debts. She passed last winter, and I was facing life as a seamstress in a factory, working 14 hours a day for pennies, or... She trailed off, embarrassed. Or becoming someone's wife, Matthew finished for her. Yes, Mr. Jenkins's letters promised comfort and respect. He said he was looking for a companion in his advancing years. She laughed bitterly. He's barely 40. And now? What do you want now? Matthew asked softly. Nora stopped walking and turned to face him. I want to never be desperate again. I want to build a life where I have choices. Matthew nodded. That's fair. And brave. After a moment he added, I hope, when you're ready, you might consider me as one of those choices. The day of Jenkins's trial arrived 6 weeks after Nora's aborted wedding. She testified about his behavior and the letters he had sent her, which prosecutors argued showed a pattern of deception. The trial lasted 3 days, and to no one's surprise, Jenkins was found guilty and sentenced to hang. The night after the verdict, Matthew found Nora sitting alone on the hotel porch. Are you all right? He asked, taking the seat beside her. I keep thinking about how close I came to being another victim, she said quietly. If you hadn't stopped the wedding. But I did, he said simply. And now you're safe. Nora turned to look at him. Why did you do it? You didn't know me. Matthew was quiet for a moment. I knew of Jenkins and his reputation. When I saw you arrive, how frightened you looked, I couldn't stand by and watch another woman fall into his trap. He smiled ruefully. And then I met you, and I knew I'd done the right thing. Thank you, she whispered. I owe you my life. You don't owe me anything, Matthew insisted, except perhaps the pleasure of your company at the Founders' Day dance next Saturday? Nora smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. I'd like that very much. The Founders' Day celebration was Pecos's biggest annual event. The town square was decorated with bunting and lanterns, and a band played lively tunes as couples twirled across a wooden platform erected for dancing. Nora wore her best dress, a blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. When Matthew saw her, his face lit up with such genuine admiration that Nora felt her cheeks flush. You look beautiful, he said, offering his arm. As they danced, Nora felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: joy. Matthew was attentive but not possessive, kind but not condescending. When he looked at her, she felt seen, truly seen. "You know," he said as they paused for lemonade, "I've been saving to buy land outside town. There's a nice parcel with a creek running through it. Good for cattle." "Is that your dream? To be a rancher?" Nora asked. Matthew nodded. "My father was a deputy like me, but he always wanted his own spread. He died before he could make it happen." He looked at her intently. "What about you? What's your dream?" Nora considered the question seriously. "I think I'd like a home, not just a house but a true home, with books and music and laughter." She hesitated. "And children someday, with the right person." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. As summer turned to fall, Nora and Matthew's courtship blossomed. She continued working at the dress shop, saving money and building a reputation for her skilled work. Matthew remained a deputy but spent his free time improving the land he'd purchased, building a modest cabin with help from friends. Jenkins's execution came and went. Nora didn't attend but spent the day working quietly, feeling a complex mix of emotions: relief, sadness for the lives lost, gratitude for her narrow escape. That evening, Matthew came to call, looking solemn. "It's done," he said simply. Nora nodded. "I know." She took his hand. "I'm ready to look forward now, not back." The following Sunday, after church, Matthew took Nora for a drive in his wagon. "I want to show you something," he said cryptically. They drove for about an hour, leaving Pecos behind and following the river upstream. Finally, they turned onto a narrow track that led to a clearing. In the center stood Matthew's cabin, but it looked different from when she'd last seen it. The porch now had a railing with flower boxes. Curtains hung in the windows. A rocking chair sat on the porch. "You've been busy," Nora said, surprised. Matthew helped her down from the wagon. "Come see." Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. There was a kitchen area, a table with chairs, and a separate bedroom. But what caught Nora's eye was the bookshelf, already filled with volumes, and beside it, a small piano. "Matthew," she breathed, "how did you know?" "You said you wanted a home with books and music," he replied, watching her face anxiously. "Do you like it?" Nora turned to him, tears in her eyes. "It's perfect, but I don't understand." Matthew took her hands in his. "Nora Vaughn, I know we haven't known each other long by some standards, but I feel like I've known you forever. You're the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I've ever met." He dropped to one knee. "I'm not a wealthy man, and this isn't a mansion, but everything I have and everything I am is yours, if you'll have me. Will you marry me?" Nora looked around at the cabin, at the home he had created with her dreams in mind, and back at the man kneeling before her. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Matthew Young." Their wedding, 2 weeks later, couldn't have been more different from the ceremony that had almost bound her to Jenkins. The church was full of townspeople who had come to know and care for Nora. Mrs. Wilson had helped her make a simple but elegant white dress. Flowers decorated the altar, and when she walked down the aisle this time, it was toward a man whose eyes shone with love, not calculation. "I, Matthew, take thee, Nora, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he vowed, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When Nora repeated the vows, she meant every word with all her heart. That night, as they stood on the porch of their cabin, their home, Matthew wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Are you happy, Mrs. Young?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. Nora leaned back against him. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "I promise you," he said, turning her to face him, "that I will spend every day trying to make you as happy as you make me." Their life together began simply. Matthew continued his work as a deputy while gradually building up their small cattle herd. Nora divided her time between helping at the dress shop and making their cabin truly a home. They planted a garden, got chickens, and adopted a stray dog that Matthew found on patrol. 6 months after their wedding, Nora awoke one morning feeling ill. The town doctor confirmed what she had begun to suspect: they were expecting a child. When she told Matthew that evening, his face lit up with such joy that she thought her heart might burst. "A baby," he whispered in awe, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." As Nora's body changed with pregnancy, Matthew's tender care never faltered. He built a cradle, working late into the night after his duties were done. He insisted she rest when she seemed tired, though she often had to remind him she was having a baby, not suffering from some delicate condition. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she would tell him with a laugh. "I'm perfectly capable of gathering eggs or sweeping the floor." Their son, James Thomas Young, was born on a stormy night in April 1879. The labor was difficult, and for hours Matthew paced outside their bedroom while the midwife and Mrs. Wilson attended to Nora. When at last he heard the baby's cry, he nearly broke down the door in his haste to see them. Nora, exhausted but radiant, held their son in her arms. "Meet your son, Deputy Young," she said softly. Matthew approached the bed almost reverently. When he took the tiny bundle in his arms, tears streamed unashamedly down his face. "He's perfect," he whispered, "just like his mother." Life with a baby brought new joys and challenges. James, called Jamie, was a good-natured child with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. He grew quickly, crawling and then toddling around their expanding home as Matthew added rooms to accommodate their growing family. When Jamie was 2, Sheriff Caldwell announced his retirement. To Nora's mix of pride and concern, the town council asked Matthew to take his place. "It's a dangerous job," she said that night as they discussed it. "More dangerous than being a deputy." "It is," Matthew acknowledged, "but it would mean more money for us, for Jamie's future. And I believe I could do some good." Nora looked at him thoughtfully. "You're a good man, Matthew Young. If you want this, I support you completely." Matthew was sworn in as Sheriff of Pecos the following month. His fairness and integrity quickly earned him the respect of the townspeople and even the grudging acknowledgement of the rougher elements that passed through. That winter brought another surprise Nora was expecting again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in the summer of 1882, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth Rose. "She looks just like you," Matthew said in wonder as he gazed at their daughter's delicate features. "Poor child," Nora teased. "No," Matthew said seriously. "Lucky child. To be as beautiful and kind and strong as her mother." As their children grew, so did their ranch. Matthew hired help so he could balance his duties as sheriff with the needs of their expanding operation. Nora became known for her quilts and fine sewing, taking commissions from as far away as El Paso. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching 5-year-old Jamie and 3-year-old Elizabeth play in the yard with their dog, Matthew took Nora's hand. "Do you ever think about how differently things could have turned out?" he asked quietly. Nora squeezed his hand. "Sometimes, if you hadn't stopped that wedding. If you hadn't been brave enough to start over in a strange town. If you hadn't been kind enough to help a frightened woman who had nothing to offer you in return." Matthew brought her hand to his lips. "You offered me everything, Nora. A reason to be a better man. Family. A love I never thought I'd find. Their conversation was interrupted by Elizabeth running up to show them a wildflower she had picked. Jamie followed, proudly displaying a toad he'd caught. "Look, Pa, can I keep him?" Jamie asked excitedly. "Only if you build him a proper home," Matthew replied seriously. "Every creature deserves a good home." Later that night, after the children were asleep, Nora and Matthew sat by the fire. She was stitching a new dress for Elizabeth while he cleaned his revolver, a nightly ritual from his days as a deputy that he continued as sheriff. "I got a letter today," Nora said, "from Sarah Johnson in Boston. Do you remember? I wrote to her when we first married." "Your friend from school?" Matthew asked, not looking up from his work. "Yes, she's finally written back after all this time." Nora set down her sewing. "She said she always wondered what happened to me after my mother died. She'd heard rumors I'd gone west as a mail-order bride." Matthew looked up. "What did you tell her?" "In your letter, I mean." Nora smiled. "I told her I found a home in Texas, that I married a kind, brave man who treats me as an equal, that we have 2 beautiful children and a good life." "Is it a good life?" Matthew set aside his work and moved to sit beside her on the settee. "The best life," Nora said softly. "Far better than anything I could have imagined when I stepped off that stagecoach." Matthew wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "I remember that day so clearly. You looked so lost and afraid, but there was something in your eyes, a determination. I couldn't look away." "And now?" she asked, leaning into him. "Now I still can't look away," he said simply. "And I never want to." As their family and ranch prospered over the years, Nora sometimes reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her to Pecos. The desperate choice to become a mail-order bride had nearly led to disaster but had ultimately delivered her to unexpected happiness. In 1885, when Jamie was 6 and Elizabeth 4, Nora gave birth to twins Robert and Richard. The boys were identical in appearance but opposite in temperament. Robert was serious and thoughtful like his father, while Richard was boisterous and adventurous. For children, Matthew marveled one evening as they watched their brood playing in the yard. "If someone had told me 10 years ago that I'd be sheriff of Pecos with a beautiful wife and 4 children, I'd have said they were loco. And a successful ranch," Nora added. "Don't forget that." Indeed, the young ranch had grown to be one of the more prosperous in the county, though not the largest. Matthew had a good eye for cattle and a better one for hiring reliable hands. They had built a larger house as their family expanded, but kept the original cabin standing, a reminder of their beginnings. In 1890, 12 years after Nora had first arrived in Pecos, the town held a celebration for Matthew's 10th anniversary as sheriff. The festivities included a picnic, a dance, and the presentation of a silver star to replace his old tin badge. "Sheriff Young has kept our town peaceful and prosperous for a decade," Mayor Wilson declared to the assembled townspeople. "Crime is down, business is up, and Pecos is known throughout Texas as a decent place to live and work." As the crowd applauded, Matthew took Nora's hand and pulled her forward to stand beside him. "I appreciate the honor," he said, his voice carrying across the town square. "But the real reason Pecos has thrived is standing right here." He looked at Nora with such love that she blushed. "My wife taught me what true courage looks like. She came here as a stranger, faced terrible danger, and chose to stay and build a life. Everything good in my life, I owe to her." That night, as they prepared for bed, Nora brought up something that had been on her mind. "Matthew, have you ever thought about running for mayor next election? Mayor Wilson mentioned he's not seeking another term." Matthew looked surprised. "Politics? Me? I'm just a lawman." "You're more than that," Nora insisted. "You care about this town and its people. You have vision. The ranchers respect you, and so do the townspeople. I'd have to give up being sheriff, he said thoughtfully. Would that be so terrible? You've done it for 10 years. The twins are starting school soon. Maybe it's time for a change. Matthew considered this. Would you want me to? Run for mayor? I want you to do what makes you happy, Nora said. But yes, I think you'd be wonderful at it. The following spring, Matthew Young announced his candidacy for mayor of Pecos. To no one's surprise, he won handily. His first act was to appoint his longtime deputy, Frank Miller, as the new sheriff. As mayor, Matthew worked to bring the railroad spur line to Pecos, arguing that it would boost the local economy and provide better access to markets for the ranchers. The project took 3 years of negotiations and planning, but in 1894, the first train pulled into Pecos Station to great celebration. Life wasn't without its hardships. A drought in 1895 nearly ruined many local ranchers, including the Youngs. They survived by selling off part of their herd and tightening their belts. But some of their neighbors weren't so fortunate. We should help the Petersons, Nora said one evening after hearing that the family was considering leaving Pecos. They've lost almost everything. What do you have in mind? Matthew asked. The next day, Nora organized the women of Pecos to prepare food and gather clothing and supplies for the struggling families. Matthew worked with the bank to extend credit to those who needed it most, securing the loans with his own good name when necessary. Their oldest son, Jamie, now 16, took on more responsibility at the ranch during this difficult time. Elizabeth, at 14, helped Nora with her increasingly successful sewing business, which had expanded to include ready-made clothes sold in the general store. The twins, Robert and Richard, 11 years old and full of energy, were tasked with helping around the ranch and house. Robert took to bookkeeping with surprising aptitude, while Richard preferred working with the horses. As the century drew to a close, Nora and Matthew celebrated 20 years of marriage. Their children organized a surprise anniversary party, inviting friends and neighbors from miles around. 20 years, Matthew marveled as they danced under the stars. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that I saw you step down from that stagecoach. And sometimes, Nora replied with a smile, it feels like I've loved you forever. The turn of the century brought new challenges and opportunities. Jamie, at 21, announced his intention to study law in Austin. I want to make a difference, like you and Ma have, he told his father. Elizabeth, at 19, had caught the eye of the new doctor's son, a serious young man who asked Matthew for permission to court her. She's too young, Matthew grumbled to Nora after giving his reluctant blessing. She's older than I was when I came to Pecos, Nora reminded him gently. That's different, Matthew protested. Is it? I think Elizabeth knows her own mind just as I did. The twins, now 16, were as different as ever. Robert talked of attending business college, while Richard wanted nothing more than to work the ranch. In 1903, 25 years after Nora's arrival in Pecos, she and Matthew stood together watching their daughter marry the young doctor who had courted her so diligently. She looks so happy, Nora whispered, dabbing at her eyes. He better keep her that way, Matthew replied, though the threat was softened by the proud smile on his face. Later that year, Jamie returned from law school and opened a practice in Pecos. Robert left for college in Dallas, and Richard took on more responsibility at the ranch, showing a natural talent for breeding and training horses. One evening, as Nora and Matthew sat on their porch watching the sunset, a nightly ritual they had maintained through all the years, she leaned her head against his shoulder. Do you remember what you said to me the day you proposed? She asked. Matthew smiled. I said a lot of things that day. I was nervous as a cat in a roomful of rocking chairs. You said, I'm not a wealthy man, and this isn't a mansion, but everything I have and everything I am is yours, if you'll have me. I remember, he said softly. "You've given me so much more than you promised," Nora said. "A life filled with love and purpose, children to be proud of, a community that feels like family." Matthew kissed the top of her head. "You're the one who gave me everything, Nora. You took a chance on a deputy with dreams of a ranch and turned those dreams into reality." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, holding hands as they had done countless evenings before. The ranch house behind them was quiet now that their children were grown, but it was still filled with the memories of laughter, tears, arguments, reconciliations, and most of all, love. In 1908, 30 years after she had stepped off the stagecoach as a frightened mail-order bride, Nora sat in the front pew of the Pecos church, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Matthew, his hair now silver but his blue eyes still bright, stood at the pulpit to address the town as he prepared to step down as mayor after serving for 15 years. "Pecos has been good to me and my family," he said, his gaze finding Nora in the crowd. "But everything good in my life began the day I met a brave young woman who had traveled across the country to marry a man she'd never met. By some miracle, she chose to stay in our town even after learning the truth about that man. And by an even greater miracle, she eventually chose me." After the ceremony, as they walked arm in arm to the reception at the hotel, Nora squeezed Matthew's hand. "You know," she said, "when I arrived here, I thought my life was ending. I had no hope, no real future. I was just trying to survive. And now?" Matthew asked, though he knew the answer. Nora stopped and turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. Around them, their family and friends continued toward the hotel, giving them a moment alone. "Now I know my life was just beginning," she said softly. "Every day with you has been a gift, Matthew Young. Even the hard days. Especially the hard days, because those are the ones that showed me what we could overcome together." Matthew's eyes shone with emotion. "I made you a promise on our wedding day that I would spend every day trying to make you as happy as you make me. Have I kept that promise?" Nora reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar lines that years of laughter and worry had etched there. "You have kept every promise you ever made to me, and then some. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." "No," Matthew said, shaking his head. "We saved each other." As they continued toward the hotel, where their family waited to celebrate with them, Nora reflected on the long, unlikely journey that had brought her to this moment. The desperate choice that had led her to Pecos. The cruel man she had almost married. And the kind, brave cowboy who had said, "I'll marry you," offering her not just safety, but love. It had been a risk, perhaps the greatest risk of her life, to stay in this dusty Texas town after her narrow escape. But as Matthew had reminded her many times over the years, the greatest rewards often came from the biggest risks. And the reward of their life together had exceeded anything she could have imagined that day long ago when she stepped off the stagecoach into an unknown future. That night, after the celebration had ended and they had returned to the ranch house that had been their home for so many years, they sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a quilt against the evening chill. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "I was thinking about how life takes such unexpected turns," Nora replied. "How the worst day of my life, the day I almost married Bartholomew Jenkins, turned out to be the luckiest day instead, because it brought me to you. I've always believed that God puts people in our path when we need them most," Matthew said. "I needed you as much as you needed me, though I didn't know it until I saw you." As stars appeared in the vast Texas sky above them, Nora rested her head against her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that whatever twists and turns still lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything for the past 30 years together, with love, courage, and unwavering faith in each other. "I love you, Matthew Young," she whispered. "And I love you, Nora Young," he replied. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days that follow. In the quiet of the evening, surrounded by the life they had built together, Nora knew with absolute certainty that the frightened young woman who had arrived in Pecos all those years ago could never have imagined the joy that awaited her. A mail-order bride promised to a cruel man had found her true destiny in the arms of a kind cowboy, a destiny filled with love, family, and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived.